The wind on Mars never stopped. It was thin and dry, and it moved red dust across the empty land like a slow river with no end. For years, the human colony at Christ Basin had lived with that wind. The colonists had built their homes under the ground, safe from the cold and the radiation, and every day they sent small robots out into the dust to look for water, metal, and anything else that might help them survive. Dr. Mira Okafor was not looking for a warship. She was looking for ice. She was the lead geologist for the Christ survey team, and her job was simple: find water under the red rock so the colony could grow. That morning, she sat in the control room with a cup of weak coffee, watching numbers scroll across her screen. The ground-penetrating radar drone, a small flying machine called Digger 3, was sweeping a canyon 200 kilometers north of the base. It had been flying for 6 hours. Mira was tired. She almost missed the warning. A red light blinked on her console. "Huh," she said, sitting up. "That's not ice." Her assistant, a young engineer named Tomas Reyes, looked over from his own station. "What is it?" "I don't know," Mira said. "The radar is showing something under the canyon floor. Something big. And it's not rock." Tomas came over and looked at the screen. The radar image showed a long shape buried under 50 meters of dust and stone. It was smooth, symmetrical, and far too straight to be natural. It looked like a needle lying on its side, nearly 800 meters long. "That can't be right," Tomas said. "Nothing that big has ever been found on Mars. Not by us, not by anyone." "Run it again," Mira said. He ran it again. The shape was still there. Word spread through the colony fast. Within a day, the colony director, an old and careful woman named Elena Vasquez, had approved a full excavation team. Within a week, ships from Earth were already on their way, carrying scientists, engineers, and a few quiet men and women who did not say much about who they worked for. Mira suspected they were with Earth's new Defense Council, the group formed after humanity had first made contact with alien nations 5 years earlier. That first contact had changed everything. Humanity had believed itself alone in the universe. Then, one day, an alien ship had entered the solar system, calling itself an envoy of the coalition of bright stars, a group of species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. The aliens were not unkind, but they were not gentle either. They looked at humanity the way an old teacher looks at a child who just learned to read. Humans were new. Humans were weak. Humans had no real fleet, no real technology beyond their own solar system, and no real place at the table where the older species made their decisions. Humanity had been given a seat, but it was the smallest seat in the room. So when the news came that something buried on Mars might be old, might be big, and might be built by human hands long before anyone alive could remember, the whole planet held its breath. The excavation took 3 months. Mira stayed for all of it. She could not have left even if she wanted to. Every day, the diggers cleared away more dust, more rock, more time. Slowly, the shape in the ground became a shape that could be seen with human eyes, not just radar. It was a ship. Its hull was dark gray, almost black, made of a metal that no scanner could fully identify. It had no rust, despite being buried for what the geologists guessed was thousands of years. Its lines were sharp and cold, built for war, not exploration. Along its sides were rows of long slots that looked like they had once held weapons. The engineers named it the Hollow Reach, after words found stamped near what looked like an entry hatch. Nobody knew what language it was, but a young linguist on the team, a quiet man named Dae-Hyun Cho, spent weeks studying the symbols and finally announced that they were an old form of English, twisted by time, but readable if you knew where to look. "This is human writing," he said at the press meeting that followed, his voice careful. "I am certain of it. This ship was built by us, or by people like us." The news exploded across Earth and across the growing human presence in space. Humans had a warship, an old one built long before recorded history remembered. The alien delegates on Earth, calm as always, asked to see it. Earth's Defense Council said no, not yet. Mira did not care about the politics. She cared about the ship itself. She was one of the first allowed inside, along with a small team wearing full pressure suits. breathing tanks strapped to their backs, moving slowly through a hallway that had not felt the touch of light in longer than human civilization had existed. Inside, the ship was dark and silent. Dust from thousands of years had settled into every corner, but the walls were smooth and unbroken. There were rooms that might have been living quarters, rows of small chambers that might have been crew pods, though empty of anything that looked like remains. There were no bodies, no bones, no sign that anyone had died aboard, or even that anyone had been aboard when it was buried. "It's like it was put here on purpose," Tomas said over the suit radio, his voice quiet with wonder. "Not crashed, not destroyed, just put away." They found the bridge on the fourth day inside. It was a wide room near the front of the ship, with a raised chair in the center and dark panels along every wall. Nothing lit up when they entered, nothing responded to touch. It was a tomb, cold and still, exactly like the rest of the ship. Then they found the reactor room. It was deep in the ship's belly, past a set of doors so thick that the engineering team needed 2 days to cut through them without damaging what was behind. When the doors finally opened, Mira was there, along with Tomas, Daehyun, and a nuclear engineer from Earth named Priya Anand, who had been sent specifically to study any power source they might find. The reactor sat in the center of a round chamber, a tall cylinder of dark material, wrapped in rings of metal that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. It was cold. It was dead. Priya's instruments picked up no radiation, no energy, no sign that it had ever worked at all. "It's just a shell," Priya said, disappointed. "Whatever made it run is gone. Maybe they took the core out before they buried the ship. Maybe it burned out thousands of years ago." For 2 more weeks, the team studied the reactor without success. They mapped its structure. They took samples of the metal, careful not to damage it. They tried, gently, to understand how it might have worked, though every model they built said it should not have worked at all, not with materials or physics that modern human science understood. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, with only a skeleton crew inside the ship for routine scanning, the reactor came back on. Nobody touched it. Nobody sent a signal. Sensors would later show a strange energy spike 3 seconds before it happened, as if something outside the ship had reached in and turned a key that had been sitting untouched for thousands of years. The dark rings around the cylinder began to glow with a deep blue light, and a low hum, felt more than heard, rolled through the ship's frame. The 2 engineers inside at the time, both young and both terrified, ran for the exit. Alarms across the excavation site began to scream. Within minutes, every scientist, every soldier, and every camera on Mars was pointed at the hollow reach. Mira arrived at the control tent breathless, her heart pounding. On the main screen, the ship's outline, once dark and dead, now showed faint lines of light running along its hull, tracing patterns like veins under skin. The blue glow from the reactor room could be seen through the ship's hull sensors, steady and growing stronger. "Status," Elena Vasquez said, her voice sharp, cutting through the noise in the tent. "Power output is rising," Priya said, staring at her tablet in disbelief. "It's already past anything we've ever measured from a fusion reactor. It's still climbing. Can we shut it down?" Someone asked. "We don't even know how it turned on," Priya said. "I have no idea how to turn it off." Mira stepped closer to the screen, watching the lines of light spread further across the ship's hull, watching a machine that had slept since before written history begin, slowly, to wake up. "It's not a shell anymore," she said quietly. "It's not dead. It never was." Far above Mars, in the cold dark of orbit, an alien listening post picked up the same energy spike. Within seconds, the signal was flagged, copied, and sent racing outward through relay stations built long before humans had left their own solar system, toward the heart of Coalition space, toward councils and commanders who had never once believed that humanity's first warship still had anything left to say. On Earth, in a quiet office late at night, a member of the Defense Council read the report from Mars 3 times before picking up the phone. His hands were not steady. "Wake the prime speaker," he said. "Tell her Mars just changed everything." Back in the tent at Christ Basin, Mira Okafor stood watching the glowing lines spread across the hull of a ship built by human hands, so long ago that no history book on Earth had ever recorded it. She did not know yet what the ship had been built to fight. She did not know what would come looking for it now that it had woken up. She only knew standing there in the cold Martian night, that the wind outside had gone very, very still, as if even Mars itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what humanity's oldest warship would do next. 3 days after the reactor came back on, the hollow reach was fully awake. The blue lines of light no longer flickered along the hull. They burned steady now, tracing patterns across the dark metal like rivers of glowing ink. The ground around the ship had begun to warm, melting the thin frost that formed each Martian night, and the low hum that had once been felt only inside the hull could now be heard, faintly, through the thin air outside. Mira Okafor had not slept properly in 3 days. None of the science team had. They worked in shifts around the ship, taking readings, arguing over theories, and trying to understand a machine that seemed to be, very slowly, remembering how to be a warship again. It's not just powering up randomly, Priya Anand said during one of the late-night briefings, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Look at this. She pulled up a chart showing the ship's internal energy flow. The power isn't spreading evenly. It's moving in order. First the reactor, then the core systems. Now it's reaching toward what we think are the weapon housings, and the engines. This isn't a machine breaking down. This is a machine waking up in a sequence, like a soldier getting dressed for battle. Could it attack us? Elena Vasquez asked, her voice steady despite the fear plain on her face. I don't think it sees us as a threat, Daehyun Cho said. He had been living inside the ship's systems for days now, translating what fragments of old text and symbols he could find on newly lit panels. The writing that's appearing on the walls, the new symbols lighting up. Some of it looks like status reports, fuel levels, structural integrity. It's checking itself, the way you'd check a car before a long drive. A long drive to where? Tomas asked quietly. Nobody had an answer. Word of the awakening reached Earth within minutes each time, relayed by satellites orbiting Mars, and from there it spread far beyond Earth as well. Humanity was not truly alone in the solar system anymore, not since first contact 5 years earlier, and the coalition of bright stars kept a small embassy fleet in orbit around Earth at all times, watching, learning, and reporting back to their own leaders. The coalition was not one people, it was hundreds of species, bound together by old treaties and older fears, species that had explored the stars for so long that Earth's entire recorded history was, to them, barely a single chapter in a very long book. Humanity had joined this coalition only 5 years ago, and most of its members treated humans the way an old soldier treats a child who picked up a toy sword. Interesting, harmless, not worth much concern. That was, until the Hollow Reach woke up. Aboard the coalition embassy ship in Earth orbit, an alien diplomat named Sel Kavran read the report from Mars for the 4th time. Sel belonged to a species called the Ithvani, tall and thin, with skin like pale gray stone, and eyes that saw far more of the light spectrum than human eyes ever could. Sel had lived for over 300 years and had studied the rise and fall of a dozen civilizations. Nothing in that long life had prepared Sel for what the sensors near Mars were now reporting. This power signature, Sel said to the 2 other diplomats in the room, matches nothing in our records. Nothing built by any current member species. It is old, far older than the humans themselves seem to understand. You think this ship predates human civilization? Asked the second diplomat, a squat, 4-armed being named Rur Das, who represented a trading species called the Kelvashi. I think, Sel said carefully, that the humans have forgotten more about themselves than they realize. The third figure in the room said nothing. He was called Commander Athos Vool, and he did not belong to a species that spoke much at diplomatic gatherings. The Venar were a warrior culture, old and proud, and they served the coalition mostly as its military arm. Athos had been sent to Earth quietly, months before, after certain signals from deep space had made coalition high command uneasy. He had said little in 5 years of watching humanity. He said little now. But his eyes, black and depthless, stayed fixed on the report from Mars for a long time after the others had stopped talking. Send this to High Command, Athos said finally. All of it, immediately. Is that necessary? Rurdos asked. It's a single old wreck. The humans are excited, but it changes little. They still have no fleet, no real military presence beyond their own world. You misunderstand, Athos said, standing slowly. His voice was low and even. This is not about what the humans have now. This is about what they once had, and why they no longer remember it. He left the room without another word. On Mars, the scientists had begun to notice something else. As the ship's systems came further online, faint records began appearing on some of its interior screens, fragments of data too old and too damaged to fully translate, but enough to make Daehyun's hands shake as he read them. "There's a name," he told the team gathered around him one evening, his voice quiet, "for the ship's original crew, or maybe for the whole fleet it belonged to. The word keeps repeating. Vanguard." "Vanguard of what?" Mira asked. "I don't know yet," Daehyun said. "But there's another word that keeps showing up beside it. It's damaged, half erased, but I think it says, Threshold War." The room went quiet.
"A war," Elena Vasquez said slowly. "Against who?"
"I don't know," Daehyun admitted. "The records are old. Whatever they were fighting, whoever they were fighting, the information about it seems to have been damaged or deliberately hidden. But this ship wasn't a lone wreck. It was part of something bigger, a fleet, built for a war that humanity, somehow, completely forgot." That night, alarms went off across the Christ Basin colony. Long-range sensors, upgraded weeks earlier after the ship's discovery, picked up a new vessel entering the solar system at a speed no human ship had ever achieved. It was Coalition in design, sleek and dark, moving with the unmistakable purpose of a warship rather than a diplomatic craft. It did not slow as it passed Earth's orbit. It came straight for Mars. In the control tent, Elena Vasquez stood pale-faced before the tracking display. "Get me Earth command," she said. "Now." It took 12 minutes for the response to reach her. 12 long minutes, during which the alien ship drew closer and closer to Mars, its intentions unknown. When the reply finally came, it was from the Defense Council directly, and the voice on the line was tense. "That's a Venar strike cruiser," the voice said. "Coalition military. They've informed us they are coming to, quote, secure a matter of galactic security concern, unquote. They didn't ask permission. They're not planning to. They're coming for the ship," Mira said, understanding hitting her like cold water. "They know what it is, or they're afraid of what it might be." Elena turned to her science team, her voice hard. "Can we move it, hide it, anything?" Priya shook her head slowly. "It's 800 meters long, and half buried. We can't even fully wake it up on purpose, let alone move it. Whatever happens next, we're not the ones in control of that ship. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Outside, the wind had picked up again, sweeping red dust across the growing lights of the excavation camp, across the dark hull of the hollow reach, whose blue veins of light now pulsed a little faster, as if it too had felt the approach of the ship coming to meet it. High above, in the black silence between stars, the Venar cruiser closed the distance, carrying with it questions that had waited buried in Martian rock for longer than humanity itself could remember, and a warning, old and quiet, that some among the Coalition already understood far better than the humans below ever could. Something had built the hollow reach to fight a war so terrible that entire records of it had been lost or hidden, and now, after thousands of years of silence, that same something might already know its old weapon had woken up. The Venar cruiser entered Mars orbit at dawn, its dark hull catching the thin red light of the rising sun. From the ground, it looked like a blade hanging in the sky, sharp and patient, waiting for something to happen. Commander Athos Voul stood on its bridge, watching the planet below through a wide viewport. He had requested this posting himself, over the objections of 2 other Coalition officers who thought a diplomatic matter did not need a warrior's hand. Athos had not argued with them. He had simply gone anyway. "Report," he said to his second officer, a smaller Venar named Isk Baru. "The excavation site is directly below us," Isk said. "Human presence is minimal. No orbital defenses. No weapons capable of threatening this ship." He paused. "The artifact itself is a different matter. Power output continues to rise. Our sensors read energy patterns, consistent with an active military-grade reactor. Old design, very old, possibly predating our own oldest recorded technology." Athos said nothing for a long moment. "Open a channel to the humans." On the ground, in the crowded control tent at Christ Basin, Elena Vasquez received the request with a tight jaw. She looked at Mira, at Priya, at the small circle of tired scientists who had not slept in what felt like days. Put it through, she said. Athos Voul's voice, calm and deep, filled the tent. This is Commander Athos Voul, of the Coalition military vessel, Ashen Blade. I am here under Coalition Security Directive to assess an artifact of unknown origin and unknown threat level. I request immediate access to the site. Elena's voice did not waver. This artifact was discovered on human territory, Commander. It belongs to humanity. We have no obligation to hand it over. I am not asking you to hand it over, Athos said. I am asking to assess it. If I judge it to be a threat to Coalition space, it will be secured, whether or not humanity agrees. I would rather this be done with cooperation than without it. The tent went silent. Mira felt her stomach tighten. She had spent months studying the ship, learning its shape, its silence, its slow and strange awakening. The idea of a stranger's hands reaching into it, perhaps taking it away entirely, felt like a wound before it had even happened. Why does the Coalition care so much about one old wreck? Elena asked. You have technology far beyond what we've found here. What threat could it possibly pose to you? There was a pause on the line, longer than before. Because, Athos said finally, we know what built ships like this, and we know that anything strong enough to build a weapon capable of frightening the species that built it into hiding is not something any of us can afford to underestimate, least of all you. Nobody in the tent had an answer for that. Athos was given landing clearance an hour later, more out of necessity than choice. Elena knew that refusing outright would likely mean force, and Earth's Defense Council, consulted urgently, had agreed that cooperation, however unwilling, was the safer path for now. A shuttle descended from the Ashen Blade and landed a short distance from the dig site, kicking up a cloud of red dust that took several minutes to settle. Athos Voul stepped out first. He was tall, even for a Venar, with dark gray skin marked by pale scars along one side of his face, old wounds from battles he never spoke of. He wore no armor, only a simple dark uniform, though Mira noticed the two soldiers behind him carried weapons unlike anything she had seen before, sleek and quiet, built for purposes she did not want to imagine. Dr. Okafor, Athos said, reading her name from a small device on his wrist as he approached. You led the discovery. I did, Mira said, straightening despite her exhaustion. Then you will walk with me, Athos said. It was not quite a question. They walked together toward the ship, the massive dark hull rising from the red ground like a mountain that had decided, after thousands of years, to become something else. The blue lines along its surface pulsed steadily now, brighter than they had been even a day earlier. You said something built this to fight against something worse, Mira said as they walked. What was it? Athos was quiet for a moment. We do not have a name for it in any language your translators would understand easily. The oldest Coalition records call it, roughly, the Devourer of Thresholds, a force, or a fleet, or perhaps something else entirely, that swept through this region of the galaxy long before the Coalition itself was formed. Entire species vanished. Entire star systems were left empty. What little we know comes from ruins, much like this one, found scattered across a dozen worlds. And you think humanity fought it, Mira said slowly. I think, Athos said, that whatever built this ship believed it needed a weapon strong enough to face something capable of ending civilizations. And I think that whoever built it did not survive long enough to remember doing so. He looked at her directly. Your species calls this the first human warship. I would ask you to consider, Dr. Okafor, that it may not be humanity's first war at all, only the first one you were allowed to remember. They reached the ship's entrance, the same hatch Mira had walked through months earlier, when it was still cold and dark. Now the metal beneath her boots hummed faintly, alive in a way it had not been before. Inside, the corridors glowed with soft blue light. Athos moved through them slowly, his soldiers behind him, scanning every wall, every panel, every symbol that Daehyun had spent weeks translating. They reached the bridge last. The raised chair in the center of the room, once dark and empty, now glowed faintly at its base. As Athos approached it, the lights along the walls brightened suddenly, and a low tone rang out through the chamber, deep and resonant, like a bell struck once and allowed to fade. Every screen on the bridge flickered to life at once. Mira froze. Behind her, one of the soldiers raised his weapon on instinct, only for Athos to raise a hand sharply, stopping him. On the central screen, symbols began to form, rapid and precise, the same old form of human writing Dae-hyun had been studying for weeks. Then, slowly, a voice came through the chamber, distorted at first, then clearer, speaking in words that took a moment to understand, as if the language itself had aged and needed to remember how to be spoken. Vessel status, active. Crew, 0. Command authority, unassigned. A pause. Unknown personnel detected. Species identification in progress. Mira's heart pounded. "It's talking," she whispered. "It's actually talking." The voice continued, quieter now, almost thoughtful. Species match. Human, 98% confidence. Query. How long has this unit been dormant? Nobody answered immediately. Athos stepped forward instead, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "This is Commander Athos Vool, Coalition Military. State your designation." There was a pause, longer this time. Designation, Hollow Reach, Vanguard-class defense vessel, First Threshold Fleet. Another pause, longer still. Query. What is the current status of the Threshold War? The chamber went silent, except for the low hum of the reactor far below. Mira looked at Athos, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something on his face that looked almost like fear. "The war you are asking about," Athos said slowly, choosing each word with care, "ended a very long time ago. Long before any of us here were born, long before the records that survived it could tell us clearly who won. There was a silence from the ship that felt, somehow, heavier than any silence before it." "Understood," the voice said finally. "Recalculating mission parameters." A pause. Query. Is the enemy still active? Nobody in the room had an answer. Mira felt the cold weight of that question settle over her, over the whole ship, over every glowing blue line running through its ancient hull. Somewhere far above Mars, the ashen blade continued its silent orbit, and somewhere far beyond that, in the dark between stars, whatever the Hollow Reach had once been built to fight might still be listening for the day one of its old enemies decided, at last, to wake up. Nobody had a good answer for the ship's question, and the ship did not ask it again. Instead, over the following days, the Hollow Reach settled into a strange kind of patience, as if it had decided that waiting for information was simply another task to perform correctly. Dae-hyun Cho worked almost without sleep, sitting for hours in front of the bridge's main console, exchanging slow, careful sentences with the ship's mind. It called itself, when asked, simply the Warden, a term that seemed to mean something between caretaker and guardian, in the old language stamped across its hull. "It's not like the AI systems we build now," Dae-hyun told the team gathered in the tent one evening, his voice hoarse. "It doesn't think in numbers and probabilities, the way our computers do. It thinks like someone who has been given one job for their entire life, and has been doing that job alone in the dark for thousands of years." "Can we trust it?" Elena Vasquez asked. "I think it doesn't understand the question," Dae-hyun said. "It was built to defend humanity. As far as it's concerned, that's not something you trust or don't trust. It's just what it is." Athos Vool listened to all of this quietly from the back of the tent, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. He had remained on Mars since his first meeting with the ship, his cruiser still holding orbit above, though he had sent no further demands to secure or remove the Hollow Reach. Whatever he had learned in that first conversation had changed his approach, though he had not explained exactly how. "Commander," Mira said to him one night, finding him alone outside the tent, looking up at the stars, "what aren't you telling us?" Athos did not turn around right away. "You know the name of the enemy your ship was built to fight," he said. "The Devourer of Thresholds. What you do not know is that, 6 months ago, before your reactor came back online, Coalition listening posts on the far edge of our territory detected a signal, old, faint, unlike anything catalogued in our records except for one thing." "What?" Mira asked. "It matched, almost exactly, the energy signature your ship's reactor produced the moment it woke up," Athos said. "We believed, at first, that it was some kind of echo, a leftover signal from long ago. Now, I am no longer certain." Mira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold Martian night. "You think you woke something up," she said, "not just us." Athos finally turned to face her. "I think, Dr. Okafor, that the galaxy has a way of remembering old debts, whether we wish it to or not." 3 days later, the debt came due. It began with a single alarm from the ashen blade, relayed instantly to the ground. A vessel had entered the outer edge of the solar system, moving with a speed and silence that matched nothing in coalition records. Not Vener design, not Ithvani, not Kelvashi, not human. It did not answer hails, it did not slow down. It came directly toward Mars. All personnel to shelter. Elena's voice rang out across the colony speakers, tense but controlled. This is not a drill. In the control tent, Priya stared at the tracking display, her face pale. It's fast, she said, faster than anything we've ever tracked. At this speed, it'll reach Mars orbit in under 6 hours. Atheus was already moving, speaking rapid orders into his communicator, calling his soldiers back to full readiness, calling the Ashen Blade to prepare for engagement. Get everyone underground, he told Elena, now. What about the ship? Mira asked, glancing toward the hollow reach, its blue lines glowing steady and bright against the darkening sky. Nobody answered her question. There was no time. The unknown vessel entered Mars orbit 5 hours and 40 minutes later, a dark shape that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect it. It did not attack the colony directly. Instead, it moved toward the Ashen Blade, weapons already firing before any hail could be exchanged, before anyone even knew for certain what they were facing. The Ashen Blade returned fire immediately, its weapons flashing bright against the black of space. But the enemy ship moved with a speed that made the Venar cruiser's defenses look slow and clumsy by comparison. Within minutes, the Ashen Blade had taken heavy damage, one of its engines burning, its hull scarred and venting atmosphere into the void. On the ground, everyone watched the battle unfold on the tracking screens, helpless, the distance between them and the fight above making it feel both far away and terribly close at the same time. They're going to lose. Mira felt her hands shaking. She looked toward the ship outside the tent, its blue light pulsing steadily, patiently, as it had for days. Dae-Hyun, she said suddenly. Ask it. Ask the warden if it can help. Dae-Hyun stared at her. It doesn't have a crew. It doesn't even have working engines that we know of. We haven't even confirmed if it can move. Ask it anyway, Mira said. Dae-Hyun ran to the makeshift terminal, connected to the ship's systems, typing quickly, his fingers trembling. The response came almost instantly, displayed in careful, old-fashioned words on the screen. Query received. Hostile signature matches archived threat profile. Confidence, high. Action. Engaging defense protocol. It recognizes it, Dae-Hyun said, his voice rising in disbelief. It knows what that thing is. Outside, the ground began to tremble. The blue light along the hollow reach's hull surged brighter than it had ever been, and with a deep groan of metal that had not moved in thousands of years, the ship began, slowly, to rise from the red dust that had buried it for so long. Loose rock and sand fell away from its sides in great sheets, as its full shape finally came free of the ground, a dark and ancient predator, waking at last from a very long sleep. It did not rise gracefully. It did not rise quickly. But it rose. In the tent, everyone stood frozen, watching through the reinforced windows as the massive shape climbed slowly into the Martian sky. Engines they had never seen ignite, glowing a deep, steady blue beneath its hull. Within minutes, it had cleared the atmosphere, a dark shadow moving with quiet, deliberate purpose toward the battle raging in orbit above. The enemy ship turned toward this new arrival, its weapons already reorienting, but the hollow reach did not hesitate. Weapons long buried and long silent opened fire, streams of blue-white energy lancing out across the dark of space, with a precision that made the earlier battle look like children fighting with sticks. The enemy ship's shields flared bright, once, twice, and on the third strike, failed entirely. It took less than 4 minutes. The enemy vessel broke apart in eerie silence, fragments scattering slowly into the dark, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the threat was gone. On the ground, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, all at once, the tent erupted into noise, shouts of disbelief, relief, and something that might have been the beginning of pride. Mira stepped outside slowly, looking up at the sky, where the dark shape of the hollow reach now hung steady in orbit, its blue light glowing bright against the stars, calm once more, as if simply returning to its post after a long overdue task. Athos Voul's voice crackled over the comm channel a moment later, tired but clear. Ashen Blade requesting emergency repairs. And, Dr. Okafor, he added after a pause, please inform your ship that the Coalition owes it, and your species, a very great debt. Mira looked up at the glowing shape in the sky, at humanity's first warship, finally awake after thousands of years of silence, and felt, for the first time since the discovery began, not fear, but something that felt very much like hope. The news of the battle above Mars reached Earth within the hour, and from Earth it spread outward through every relay station the coalition of bright stars had ever built. By the time the sun rose over Christ Basin the next morning, the story was already being told on 100 worlds, in 100 languages, by species that had never once thought humanity worth more than a passing glance. Humanity had a warship, an old one that had, without hesitation, destroyed a vessel that had crippled a coalition military cruiser in minutes. The questions that followed were endless. What was the enemy that had attacked? Where had it come from? What else was humanity hiding, buried and forgotten, beneath the dust of its own solar system? Mira Okafor did not have time to think about any of that in the days that followed. She was too busy simply trying to keep up. The Hollow Reach had returned to Mars orbit after the battle, settling into a slow, steady patrol pattern above the planet, as if it had simply resumed a duty it had never truly stopped performing. It spoke rarely, and only to Daehyun, who had become, almost by accident, the closest thing to a translator the ship had. Its answers were short, careful, and often left more questions than they solved. It says the enemy ship was what it calls a scout-class hunter, Daehyun reported during one of the nightly briefings, his notebook filled with careful transcriptions of the warden's words. Small, compared to what it remembers. It believes there will be more. More scouts, or more of whatever sent it? Elena Vasquez asked. It doesn't know, Daehyun admitted. It says its last clear memory before it was buried was of a retreat. A full fleet retreat, back toward Earth, to protect what it calls the cradle world. After that, there's a gap. Thousands of years of silence, until the moment it woke up. So the war didn't end, Priya said quietly. It just stopped, mid-battle. And nobody ever came back to finish it. Nobody in the room had an answer for that either. Commander Athos Voul remained on Mars for another 2 weeks, overseeing repairs to the Ashen Blade, and, more quietly, sending long, careful reports back to Coalition High Command. He met with Mira often during that time, and though he remained formal in most things, something between them had shifted since the battle, a kind of respect that had not existed before. You saved my ship, he told her one evening, standing beside her outside the excavation camp, watching the twin moons of Mars rise faintly over the horizon. My crew. Myself, most likely. I do not forget debts like that. It wasn't me, Mira said. It was the ship, the Warden. It was built by humans, Athos said. For humans. I think perhaps you underestimate how much of a debt that still leaves your species owed to no one but itself. He paused. The Coalition has spent 5 years treating humanity as a young species, unproven, untested, barely worth a seat at the table. That view will not survive what happened here. Whether that is a blessing or a burden, I cannot yet say. He was right. Within a month, everything had changed. Earth's Defense Council, once a quiet and mostly ceremonial body, found itself suddenly at the center of galactic attention. Delegations that had never bothered to visit Earth in person began arriving by the dozen, eager to see the ship for themselves, eager to understand what humanity truly was, now that the old assumptions no longer held. Some came with respect, some came with fear, quietly hidden behind polite words. A few, Mira suspected, came already planning how they might use humanity's newfound strength for their own purposes. The Hollow Reach allowed none of them aboard without human permission. It had made this clear, simply, and without argument, the very first time a Kelvashi trade delegation had tried to request a tour. This vessel serves the cradle world and its people, the Warden had said, its voice calm and unmoving. Access is granted at their discretion, not by request. It was a small thing, a single sentence spoken by a machine thousands of years old, but it echoed further than anyone expected. Humanity was no longer simply being watched. It was, for the first time since joining the Coalition, being taken seriously. Back on Mars, the excavation continued, though its purpose had changed entirely. What had once been a search for water was now a search for answers. Ground surveys across the wider Martian surface began turning up faint traces of other buried structures, smaller than the hollow reach, but similar in design. Fragments of a fleet, scattered and buried, waiting, perhaps, to be found. There might be more, Elena said one evening, standing before a wide map of Mars covered in newly marked survey points. More ships, more pieces of whatever humanity built, before all of this was forgotten. Mira looked at the map for a long time before answering. Then we should find them, she said. Before something else does. On a quiet night, near the end of that first strange month, Mira found herself standing alone beneath the hollow reach's hull once more, looking up at its dark shape resting temporarily back on the surface for further study, its blue lines glowing faint and steady in the cold Martian dark. "Warden," she said softly, unsure if it would even respond to her directly. "Do you remember anything about why you were buried, why nobody came back for you?" There was a pause, longer than usual. "Records are incomplete," the ship said finally, its voice quiet through a nearby speaker panel. "What is known? The retreat was ordered to protect the cradle world above all else. What is unknown? Whether that protection succeeded, or whether something else was lost in its place." Another pause. Query: "Does the cradle world still stand?" Mira looked up at the stars, at the quiet dark sky over Mars, thinking of Earth far beyond it, alive and whole, and utterly unaware of how close it had once come to losing everything it never even remembered having. "Yes," she said softly, "it still stands. We're still here." "Then the mission was not a failure," the warden said, and for the first time, Mira thought she heard something almost like relief in its old, careful voice. "Mission parameters updated. Standing by for further instruction." Far above, in the endless dark between stars, the wreckage of the enemy scout ship drifted silently, its pieces scattered and cold, carrying with it a signal that had already, quietly, begun its long journey back toward whatever had sent it in the first place. Somewhere out there, in the deep places between the stars where old wars are never truly finished, something ancient had just learned that humanity was awake again. And on Mars, beneath a sky full of unfamiliar visitors and old unanswered questions, humanity's first warship stood ready, its reactor glowing steady and strong, waiting patiently, as it always had, for whatever might come next.